The sun hung low like a rusted coin in a sky smeared with ash and memory as Eleanor McCrae stepped off the stagecoach, her boots crunching against the scorched earth that had once been the grounds of her promised new life. Her traveling cloak, once a regal maroon, was dulled by dust, the color of blood faded by miles and sorrow. Ahead of her, where a letter had described a homestead with ivy curling up porch rails and a chimney that smoked like a welcome, was only ruin-charred beams like broken ribs, the remnants of a life burned hollow. She said nothing. She simply took a long, slow breath, let it sear her lungs, then moved forward with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every betrayal and heartache she'd ever known. In her satchel was a deed, and in her bodice, hidden among the folds of lace and linen, were papers and keys to an inheritance she had told no soul about, not even the man she'd come to marry. Henry Tobias, the one-armed blacksmith of Red Hollow, had not answered her letters with poetry, but with honesty, with sketches of wrought iron stoves and horseshoes, with slow, careful words about rebuilding something not just a home but a life. Yet standing before the ruin now, Eleanor wondered if even his iron could mend what fire had claimed. The townsfolk had gathered like shadows behind her, whispers weaving through their number like wind through dead corn. "That's the mail-order bride," someone said. "Came all the way from Savannah for a pile of cinders," a boy snorted. "Maybe she likes broken things." Eleanor turned toward the voice, but her gaze met instead the silhouette of a man limping down the trail from the smithy, his sleeve pinned where an arm should have been. Soot on his face like war paint. Henry Tobias didn't speak right away. He removed his hat, revealing sweat-matted curls, and looked at her not with pity, but something heavier remorse perhaps, or shame. "I wrote you when it happened," he said, voice coarse with smoke and gravel. "Told the driver not to bring you. Thought maybe you'd choose not to come." Eleanor stepped past the wreckage, past the stares and murmurs, until only the wind stood between them. "I came," she said. "I'm here now." And then she added, almost a whisper, "We build from ashes, don't we?" His good hand curled into a fist, not in anger, but to steady himself. "I've got the forge, still standing. I can make nails, hinges, tools." Eleanor nodded, slowly. "And I've gold. Enough to buy timber, mules, whatever we need." His eyes narrowed. "Gold?" She smiled, but there was steel beneath it. A woman's allowed her secrets, especially when the world assumes she's got nothing. That night she did not sleep in the town's boarding house, though the barkeep's wife offered kindly. Instead, Eleanor laid a blanket beside the ruin, near the edge of the foundation, where the wind sang through broken frames like a morning hymn. Henry brought her coffee in a tin mug and sat beside her without speaking. She took the cup, cradling it in both hands. The stars were thin above them, the way they always were after fire, as though the sky itself had been scorched. "I saw this place in dreams," she said. "Not the fire, not the ruin, the life we were to make. I still see it." Henry's voice was soft. "Then let's start tomorrow." And though she closed her eyes, sleep didn't come. Only the image of ivy yet to grow, and smoke that no longer signaled ruin but resurrection. Morning in Red Hollow came with a hush, the kind of silence that follows calamity, where even birds hesitate to sing. Eleanor rose from her bed of earth and ash, her dress wrinkled, her bonnet tucked beneath her arm, and for a moment she stood in the skeletal remains of the home that had never truly been hers, the wind pressing strands of hair across her cheek like fingers brushing a piano. By the time Henry arrived with 2 mules and a cart of salvaged tools, she had already drawn plans in the dirt using a stick and the edge of her boot. Lines and symbols mapped with the precision of someone who had once overseen estates, though she never spoke of it. "You've built before," he observed quietly, laying down a bundle of iron nails wrapped in burlap. "Not with my hands," she replied. "But I've watched, listened. My father's overseer taught me things women weren't meant to know: foundations, load-bearing angles, where the sun hits best come winter." Henry gave a grunt of respect. Not quite a compliment, not quite surprise, just recognition. They worked in tandem through the morning, not speaking unless needed. She marked lumber while he hammered braces one-handed, his movements deliberate, stubbornly efficient. At midday, they ate bread and jerky beneath the shade of a lone cottonwood that had somehow survived the blaze, its trunk blackened but not bowed. She watched the sky and measured it against memory. "You think they'll come?" she asked after a long stretch of silence. "The ones who torched it?" Henry's jaw clenched. "They always do when they think you're rising," Eleanor nodded, reaching for her satchel. She unwrapped a roll of parchment and flattened it on a slab of Stonian Old Land Survey, stamped and signed by judges back east. "This land is mine now," she said. "Bought fair with inheritance bloodier than any battlefield. He didn't ask whose blood, didn't need to. The South was full of women like her, those who had watched old homes burn not from raiders or arson, but from the cost of loyalty, from the collapse of men's ambitions. What we build here," she added, "must be strong enough to outlast them." Henry touched the edge of the parchment with calloused fingers, as if confirming it was real. "Then we start with stone." For weeks they did just that, quarrying rock from the nearby ridge, shaping them one by one. The townsfolk watched with a mix of skepticism and wonder. Children whispered stories about the one-armed blacksmith and his mysterious bride with city eyes and coal-black hair. Some came to help. Most just stared. On the 15th day, the preacher stopped by. Tall man, wiry and sun-worn, with a Bible tucked under his arm and doubt in his smile. "You sure you want to rebuild here?" he asked Eleanor. God may not bless ground cursed twice. She met his gaze, her chin high. "Then we'll bless it ourselves." She turned back to the wall she was laying, pressing mortar with bare fingers, the grit cutting shallow into skin that had known silk once. The preacher left without another word. That night, Henry found her weeping by the hearthstone, the only part of the old house they'd kept intact. "You ever wonder," she whispered, "if the fight's worth it?" He knelt beside her, the firelight catching the burn scar that ran the length of his missing arm's shoulder. "Every day, and every day I choose yes." Her tears dried, not from comfort, but from resolve. "Then so will I." They didn't speak of marriage again, not directly. But in the way she poured water over his blistered hands, in the way he fashioned iron hooks and braces to help her lift timber, something unspoken began to bind them, stronger than law, stronger than flame. By the time the first snowfall dusted the foothills, the new frame stood against the sky, tall and proud. And Eleanor stood beside it with her skirts frozen at the hem and a fire in her chest that no man could extinguish. The homestead was returning not as it had been, but as something forged, reclaimed. Born not from promise, but from choice, from grit, and from the silent bond between a woman with secrets and a man who had lost much, yet still swung his hammer like he believed in tomorrow. The wind howled down from the ridge, carrying with it the bite of a coming storm and the scent of pine needles torn from their branches. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, coating the ridges with a delicate hush that softened the jagged scars of fire and toil. Eleanor stood in the barn Henry had helped her raise, holding a lantern in one hand and a ledger in the other, the flame flickering against her cheek like a whisper of memory. The animals had been few at first: 2 milk goats, a rescued mare with a limp, a coop of stubborn hens, but it was enough. Enough to breathe warmth into the land, to remind her that life was not just meant to be endured but filled again. Henry entered behind her, brushing snow from his coat, and she turned just slightly, enough for their eyes to meet in the dim glow. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked, voice low like the snow outside. "When it was all gone." He shrugged, unfastening the leather harness from his shoulder. "Thought about it. Thought about drinking myself dumb too. Didn't do either." "Why not?" "Because I knew someone might still come, someone who'd matter." He said it like a man reciting fact, not hope. Eleanor's breath caught, not from the cold. She looked down at the ledger again, fingers trembling faintly. Inside, numbers danced beside notes and tight script: timber costs, livestock trades, letters sent to distant suppliers who might yet bring a loom or seed. She had never meant to stay hidden forever. The fortune her mother had left her quiet money buried in trust wasn't endless, but it was powerful in a place like Red Hollow. What she hadn't told Henry was how many others wanted it. How many cousins, suitors, and former acquaintances had written once they'd learned a Southern girl alone had inherited what some thought should belong to them. One of those letters had arrived that morning, sealed with the wax of a legal firm she recognized. She hadn't opened it yet, couldn't. Instead, she watched Henry as he inspected the horse's hooves with practiced care, his movements deliberate despite the missing limb. "You trust me, Henry?" she asked. He glanced up, brows furrowed. That a real question? I've lied, she admitted. Not about who I am, but about what I came with. He stood and walked to her, close enough for the lantern's glow to show the soot along his jawline and the small tremor in his hand. Then say it, he said simply. I came with gold, land in Georgia, legal rights to 3 riverfront properties. I came with enough to make 5 of these homesteads. The air between them tightened. She expected bitterness, even anger, but he only looked at her a long moment, then nodded once. Then why build this with your own hands? Because if I didn't, it wouldn't be mine. Not really. He looked away, out the cracked barn window, where the snow swirled like ghosts. And what about them? The ones who'll come knocking now. They can knock, she said, but they won't get the door. That night, as the storm rolled in like thunder on hooves, Eleanor sat by the hearthstone with a letter finally open on her lap. It was from her uncle's estate attorney, demanding return of what he called misallocated family assets. It would not be the last letter, but she no longer feared them. She looked across the room to where Henry dozed in a wooden chair he'd built himself, one booted foot propped against the stone, chin tucked to chest. She folded the letter, set it in the flames, and watched it curl to black. We don't run from fire here, she whispered. We rebuild through it, and as the wind howled outside like a beast denied, the walls of the new home stood fast, the stone firm, the timber holding. Inside, 2 hearts beat steady against the dark. The thaw came slowly that year, reluctant and mean like a wounded dog, but with each reluctant drip from the eaves and crackle of ice loosening its grip on the earth, Eleanor felt the land remembering itself. Buds emerged from frost-bitten limbs, the soil softened under her boots, and the long shadows of winter retreated inch by inch. With spring came labor a different kind now, rhythmic and urgent, like breath after long silence. She and Henry rose with the sun, tending rows of young corn, mending fences, reinforcing the barn rafters in preparation for the foals that might come. But with the thaw also came visitors. The first was a man in a velvet coat, arriving in a polished buggy drawn by matched bays, his hat too fine for the wind of Red Hollow. He wore a pin at his collar Eleanor hadn't seen since childhood, crest of her mother's family, wealthy, landed, southern to the bone. Eleanor, he greeted, stepping down and ignoring the mud splashing his boots. You got my letter. I burned it, she said. Did you come to see if I'd fold it anyway? I came to give you a choice, he said smoothly. That gold you carry, it doesn't belong to you. The estate was mismanaged. If you come with me now, we can avoid unpleasantness. Trial. Shame. Henry appeared in the doorway behind her, silent as dusk, hammer still in hand. The visitor eyed him with faint disdain. Is this the life you want, Eleanor? Dirt under your nails, scandal at your heels, hiding behind a half-man. Eleanor stepped forward until her skirts brushed the buggy wheel. This dirt is mine. This man is whole. And you, she added, are nothing but a leech trying to drink what you never earned. The man flushed but recovered with a lawyer's sneer. Then expect notice. You'll be hearing from my counsel. I'll be sure to line the chicken coop with it. He left, wheels slinging mud as he turned back toward the east, toward the city where titles mattered more than truth. That night, Henry didn't speak of it, but she found him in the smithy late, hammering iron with more force than precision. She stepped inside, the heat wrapping her like a memory of summer. I'm sorry you had to hear that, she said. Man's a fool, he muttered. Worse, a coward dressed in silk. He's not the last, she warned. They'll try court, maybe even fists. Henry looked up, sweat streaking his temple, and nodded once. Then let them come. I've fought men for less. You'll fight beside me? No, he said, stepping closer. I'll fight with you. Days passed, then weeks. They held their breath, but no one came. Not yet. Instead, they were gifted peace a strange and tender reprieve. Henry made her a wind chime from bent spoons and scraps of tin, and she hung it on the porch beam where it clinked like laughter in the wind. They carved their initials into the doorframe with a pocket knife, side by side like roots growing toward the same river. On Sundays, they sat by the hearth without speaking, sometimes with her mending a shirt, sometimes with him sketching an idea for a new plow harness that could be fixed one-handed. When spring bled into early summer, they planted an apple tree at the edge of the field, marking the place where they had first shared coffee over broken stone. It was Eleanor who dug the hole, hands blistering, hair plastered to her brow, and Henry who lowered the sapling in with a reverence that was almost holy. "It won't bear fruit for years," she said. "Some things are worth waiting on. You think we'll see it ripen?" she asked, not sure if she meant the tree or the life they were building. Henry only looked at her and said, "If we don't, someone will. Someone who'll know we stood here first." And with that, the wind lifted through the forge chimney, the bellows hissed like a sleeping beast exhaling, and the quiet settled again, not empty, but full. Full of all that might yet grow. The sun rose angry and red the day they came, 3 riders cutting through the dust like blades, their horses lathered and eyes cold beneath wide brims. Eleanor saw them from the field, her hands wrapped around a bushel of young squash, and in the pit of her stomach she felt the shift, the stillness before storm. Henry stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, his face unreadable. They didn't ride like lawmen. They rode like men who believed law bent in their direction. One of them, tall and lean with a crooked mustache and a scar splitting his brow, dismounted first and let his spurs drag across the steps as he ascended. "Mrs. McCrae," he said, tipping his hat without warmth. "We've come to inspect your claim. There's dispute, as you're aware." "You're not court," she replied, wiping her dirtied hands against her apron. "You're not even paper. We represent the family, executor's orders. You've got goods that don't rightly belong here. This land was purchased," she said. "This home was raised plank by our hands. You don't get to take that with a threat and a saddlebag." One of the others, stockier, leaned against the porch post and spat. "You got a fancy blacksmith here with one arm and too much pride. We could break this place in half by nightfall." Henry stepped forward then, slowly, each step deliberate. He held no gun, no hammer, just the weight of his stance, forged by pain and persistence. "Try," he said quietly. The air thickened, the tension drawn like wire. The tall man pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it out. "Court date set. You'll come to Charleston by month's end, or we'll come back and collect." Eleanor didn't touch it. "I'll come, and I'll bring truth heavier than your lies." They left without further word, but as their silhouettes disappeared into the glare, Eleanor sagged slightly, one hand catching the porch rail. Henry reached for her, not asking if she was scared. Hal already knew. "It's a stage," she whispered. "It always was. The moment I inherited that money, they started writing their parts, hoping I'd fold before the curtain rose." "You ever argued in court?" he asked. "No." "Then we'll learn," and learn they did. Every evening, she read old documents by candlelight, learning legal phrases until they coiled like rope in her memory. Henry drafted diagrams of the land, showing how it had lain fallow since the war, how none of her accusers had touched it in decades. Letters poured in, some sympathetic, some venomousin. She answered them all with ink and fire. By mid-month, she had sewn herself a new dress from navy linen, modest but proud, and when Henry saw her in it, he simply nodded and said, "You wear fight well." The night before she was to leave, they stood beneath the apple tree. It had begun to bud, impossibly early, as if refusing to wait for permission to bloom. Eleanor reached up and touched one delicate flower. "If I lose this in court, if they take it all, what will I be?" "You'll still be the one who built it," Henry said. "And that's more than they'll ever be." She turned to him, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then, softly, she asked, "Will you come with me? To Charleston?" "To stand beside me." He paused. "I'd stand beside you in hell." And in the dark that followed, they didn't kiss. They didn't need to. Their bond had been forged already, not in passion's fire, but in the steady heat of Cole's quiet, enduring, unshakable. When she left the next morning, she rode with her head high, the wind full at her back, and the sound of Henry's forge ringing in her memory like a promise. Charleston was a city of shadows wrapped in lace, where carriages clattered like restless hearts and the streets smelled of salt and secrets. Eleanor arrived with dust on her hem and steel in her spine, a worn valise in one hand and a ledger in the other. Henry walked beside her, unbothered by stares drawn to the pin of his sleeve, to the soot-streaked lines across his shirt, to the way he carried himself not as a man broken but reforged. They checked into a modest boarding house near the courthouse, where the landlady raised a brow at their names but said nothing. The next morning they entered the hall where Judgment lived, a great wooden chamber lined with polished pews and oil lamps that burned with practiced authority. Her cousin sat near the front, smug in a blue frock coat, flanked by men in fine boots and slick expressions. "You're late," he drawled as she approached. Eleanor gave a tight smile. "Justice tends to run slow. I figured I'd match its pace." When court was called to session, the room shifted. Lawyers stood like actors on cue, and Eleanor sat straight back beside her counsel, though most of the preparation she'd done herself. Her hands never trembled, not once. The opposing side painted her as a usurper, a distant niece with no blood claim to the inheritance, a woman of questionable character who had moved west to avoid scrutiny. They tried to twist Henry's presence into scandal, implying indecency, impropriety, shame. But she rose when her turn came, cleared her throat, and unrolled the documents like a general laying down maps of war, deeds, letters, bank ledgers, witness statements, land surveys signed in ink older than her cousin's ambition. Her voice was calm, edged in conviction. "I did not take what wasn't mine," she said. "I built something out of nothing but ashes and a man's belief in me. I didn't run from my family. I ran from the cage they built with their names." A murmur passed through the room. One of the judges leaned forward. "And what, precisely, do you intend to do with this fortune, should it remain in your hands?" "Grow," she answered simply. "Land, homes, dignity, for those who've been told they deserve none of it." When Henry stepped to the stand, he said little. Only this: she worked harder than any man I've known. Built with her hands, fed with her heart. If you think she's unworthy, then I question your measure of worth. In the end, it took the court less than an hour. The ruling came down like the crack of a hammer on iron. Inheritance affirmed, claims dismissed, case closed. Her cousin stormed out before the ink had dried. That evening, as they walked beneath the gas lamps of the Charleston streets, Eleanor said little. But she carried herself differently now, not as someone defending what was hers, but as someone owning it for the first time. Henry reached out and took her hand, rough fingers curling over hers, and they walked like that past judgment, past fear, past history. When they returned to Red Hollow a week later, the trees had fully leafed out, the fields greening under early summer sun. The house stood proud on the hill, smoke curling from the chimney, the wind chimes singing a welcome song. The apple tree had bloomed entirely, each branch strung with white and pink blossoms like prayers made visible. And there, at its base, Eleanor knelt and pressed her hand to the earth. "We're done running," she whispered. Henry set down their bags and sat beside her. "No," he said softly. "We're just beginning." And in the years that followed, their home became a place others came to when fire had taken everything: widows, orphans, soldiers, those broken by law or man or time. Eleanor welcomed them all, not as a benefactor, but as one of them, as someone who knew ashes and what it meant to rise from them. Her story spread not as legend, but as promise. That in the West you could start again, that you could be more than what they named you. That even after ruin, even with only one hand and one woman's will, you could still build something the world had no power to take.